If you've ever looked at your filter and said, it's not big enough, and eventually dived down the rabbit hole of Sumps, finally said to yourself, this is the one. Yeah, I'm going to tell you why it might not be, because these giant, nonsensical things, they're a pain, and they suck. Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and we're going to go into the deep end. This is a 40-gallon sump filter. You can probably hear the echo of my voice bouncing around in this thing. And it sucks. I know. Fancy acrylic one. I'm going to tell you why sumps like this suck. Let's start on the early part. You're using a fish tank to filter your fish tank. I'm going to set this down. It's heavy. When you're using a sump like that, you're basically turning a fish tank into your filter. Now, you don't necessarily have to have this crazy custom one, right? You could do a DIY tank, and there are some less insane versions of sumps that you can purchase out there, but there's a couple of massive downsides. One, the space required for a sump basically means you're going to need something much bigger than almost any canister filter out there on the market. Even those who use smaller tanks, like a 20-gallon, 20 long, something like that, is their sump filter, you still have to have enough space underneath your tank for that entire other tank to be your fish tank filter. Immediately, one of your first problems is space. They take up a lot of space, and thus it restricts you on the usage of that filter. The next reason why sumps suck, they're expensive. Outside of building a sump yourself, DIY, and you have to be very good at DIY, which I'm not. So inherently I fall into kind of the category of a lot of fish folks out there where I'm not going to build one, I'm going to buy one. And even if you buy like one of the aquarium glass ones that are prefabbed, or whether you go all the way up to something crazy like this acrylic one I have here, they're expensive. They are as expensive just for the tank piece, the sump itself, as almost any canister filter on the market outside of the really crazy stuff. And that doesn't include any of your hardware. That doesn't include making sure that your tank is plumbed correctly. And if a tank like this that isn't drilled is what you're going to hook your sump up to, now you need an overflow box. You need all your tubing. You need a pump. You have to have a pump. So while this thing has incredible volume and customization capability, it's going to cost a lot of this. And you're going to have to know a lot of things about flow rates, how much water is going to come from a siphon. And if you're not prepared for that, a couple of different things are going to happen. Either A, this thing's going to drain your whole freaking tank if you're not prepared for it. Or B, you could eventually get to the point of where the sump isn't at the right equilibrium and too much water is being pushed out, and eventually the sump's going to run dry and kill your pump. There's a lot of difficulty in setting them up. Now, of course, once you figure out a sump, they can be amazing. Or can they? Here's the thing. Some of the other problems with sumps are really fast. They can be very noisy. If you don't have the correct set of, like, a weir on the intake in your overflow box, and then you have it going down in this specific manner so that the water is coming in under the water level, and you have to do X, Y, and Z, you have huge splashing noises. So if you already thought that like a sponge filter or certain hang-on backs when the water gets low are loud, this bad boy will put that to shame. There's a great video that's out there where one of the primary complaints is the noise from Jay Wilson like several years ago, and why he changed over from a canister from a sump. Even though one would argue the sump is the superior filter if you're going to spend that kind of money, for him, noise was a problem. So that's another reason why these sump filters suck. Here's probably the biggest one. Unlike your canister filters, your hang-on backs, your sponge filters, if you lose power and your tank is set up in a way, whether it's drilled or the overflow box sits deep enough, you can potentially flood this thing. Because when you lose power, your pump's no longer putting water back in the tank. And gravity will continue to siphon water off, or if you have a drill tank, the water's going to drain until it gets underneath those drill points, right? And if you're keeping your sump at a higher water level, which most freshwater aquarists are going to do in a submerged sump. Wet dries get a little different, and we'll talk about those in a second, but in submerged sumps, you can potentially have too much water flow into the sump and thus overflow it and flood. This is a major problem, right? Even a gallon of water on your floor can be a problem, not to mention potentially 10 or 20 gallons, maybe even more in very large tanks like your 150s, 180s, 240s, those big tanks, which is where we most commonly see sumps like this bad boy here. It's a risk. There are certainly ways to mitigate this risk, right? You can do a certain number of things, but again, that requires a level of plumbing knowledge, and again, more of this, more. The biggest problem with sumps is probably the fact that they are just excessively costly. And I'll give you an example. This fantastic beast here is a Trigger Sapphire. Beautiful. Well constructed, lots of chambers, good filter socks, all sorts of stuff. This is basically primed and ready to go for a fish keeper to customize it however they want and make it into the ultimate filter. Do you know how much these things cost? Just this box, this empty box, no pump, no tubes, no overflow box, so I have to have a drilled tank if I want to use this, and if I'm going to drill a tank, then I have to do all the plumbing work, etc., etc. Just this is like $600. Yeah. Think about that. That's like 2 FX6s. And this doesn't even have a pump on it yet. Now, of course, there's lots of benefits to a sump, but that's not why we're here. That's next week's video. We've established that they're expensive. They can be very noisy. You have to buy a ton of extra equipment, and if you don't know how to set up all that equipment properly, and you don't understand things, you're going to need to do a lot of research, and if you don't do that research correctly, you could very easily flood your house and empty your fish tank and kill your fish. Now, hopefully, your water level is not so low that it can empty the entire tank. Maybe it only empties half or a third, something like that to play it safe. But still, there is that risk. And that risk can be really scary for a number of people. The final thing that I will tell you about sumps, and why they suck, honestly, is this. You actually don't need it. You don't need this much. Now, some people might say, well, I want to do X, Y, and Z, or I've got this plan, or I'm gonna make it so that my maintenance is super fast, right? Because you can set up a sump to where basically your maintenance is only clean your filter socks. And if you have enough filter socks, you're going to swap in the fresh ones, take the dirty ones, go clean them, and walk away and let them dry. And you could do that like once a week. And it's not too bad. But the thing is, these things are so big, they have so much capacity, that it's unlikely that a majority of fish keepers are keeping a tank that even remotely requires something this excessive. Even a very large African cichlid tank with a super high density of fish that has a massive bio load can still be sufficiently covered by just a pair of canister filters. And when we start talking about those massive tanks, that's when you start needing giant sumps like this thing that are going to cost you, in the end, $600, $800, maybe even $1,000 just for your filter. And you could have multiple FX6s for that price, and now you've got multiple potential filters to protect you and cover you, and the likelihood of some of those other problems happening with the canister significantly lower. That's it. That's why sumps suck. For the true aficionados out there, lords and ladies of the sump, you truest aristocrats of the fish hobby, you'll probably rip me up in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. Next week, we are going to talk about all the benefits of a sump and why people will go to this level of crazy, even on a freshwater tank. And obviously, I own one, so I'm willing to go that level of crazy, and we'll explain why next week. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. If you've enjoyed this video, Give it a thumbs up. If you learned a lesson, maybe you didn't learn a lesson, maybe you had no clue I had this thing, leave a comment down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.